In the county of Devon in the UK, there's an area called Dartmoor, and it can be an eerie place to travel. Strange mists are known to suddenly descend on the area, enveloping unwary travellers in a blinding fog. Tales of black dogs, throat-cutting pixies, and headless goats have terrified locals and visitors for centuries. A more recent tale, however, is that of the hairy hands. There's a road that runs a winding trail through Dartmoor, known today as the B3212. On a particularly isolated stretch of this road, between the areas of Post Bridge and Two Bridges, a number of people have had a terrifying encounter with an entity known only as hairy hands. The earliest report I can find dates back to 1921. The rather tragic case of Ernest Helby, a doctor that worked at Dartmoor prison. In March of 1921, he was riding on a motorcycle along that road between Post Bridge and Two Bridges. In a sidecar was his own wife and the prison governor's 2 daughters. As they got close to Post Bridge, the handlebar of the bike suddenly jerked to one side. The front axle broke and the bike detached itself from the sidecar. It then crashed headlong into a ditch at the side of the road. The sidecar crashed into a grass verge and the occupants escaped with minor injuries. Dr. Helby, however, fractured his skull and died at the scene. Now, I've heard 2 different stories about what happened next. In one account, a doctor who was holidaying with his family at the nearby Cherrybrook farm happened to be passing just after the accident. He saw that Dr. Helby was already dead, but he rushed to help Mrs. Helby and the 2 children. Mrs. Helby seemed to be in a state of shock, but she managed to utter a few words. She told him how her husband had suddenly lost control of the bike and muttered something about hairy hands, which didn't seem to make any sense at the time. In another version of this story, one of the children that had been in the sidecar was questioned by a police officer, and she said that just before the crash she had seen a pair of large hairy hands grab the handlebar of the bike and swerve it suddenly to one side. After the crash, the 2 girls had ran over to the bike and saw that the hairy hands were still gripping the handlebars as the bike lay in the ditch. It could be that both these stories are true. First, the wife related the story to a doctor, and later one of the children said a similar thing to the police. Or of course, neither could be true and it's simply a tragic accident with a creepy legend attached to it. A few weeks after this event, there was another strange accident on the exact same stretch of road. A coach driver suddenly lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a grassy verge, injuring several passengers when they were thrown out of their seats. The driver later reported that he'd felt a pair of invisible hands pull the wheel over to the side of the road. On the 26th of August, that very same year, an army officer was riding his motorbike along the same stretch of road when he suddenly came off his bike and was thrown onto the side of the road. Luckily, he escaped with only minor injuries. When he was later questioned about the accident, he said, "It's not my fault. Believe it or not, something drove me off the road. A pair of hairy hands closed over mine. I felt them as plainly as ever I felt anything in my life. Large, muscular, hairy hands. I fought them for all I was worth, but they were too strong for me. They forced the machine into the turf at the edge of the road, and I knew no more till I came to myself, lying a few feet away on my face on the turf." With 3 very similar accidents happening in the same place in the same year, the press got interested and reporters were sent to the area. An investigation was launched to see what had caused the accidents. Now, most reports I found online claim that the investigations deduced that an adverse camber on that stretch of the road was causing people to lose control of their vehicles, and that's usually where the story ends. However, in the book Supernatural England by Betty Puttick, it says that the camber of the road was fixed after these 3 accidents, and yet the encounters with the hairy hands didn't stop. Over the following decades, there were a number of highly unusual vehicle crashes at this location. Cars, bicycles, even horses and carts suddenly losing control as if an invisible force had taken control of them. Here's a strange story from 1961. It appears in one of the books written by folklorist Theo Brown. A young man undertook to run into Princetown on his motorcycle to get something for his landlady. In about an hour he returned to Penlee, very white and shaken, and saying that he'd had a curious experience. He said that he felt his hands being gripped by two rough and hairy hands, and every effort was made to throw him off his machine. Here's another story from the same decade. In 1962, a woman named Florence Warwick was visiting Dartmoor and travelling along this cursed section of the road. She was slightly lost and she decided to pull over to check her map. As she sat there, a cold chill came over her, and then, in her own words, she says, "I looked up and I saw a pair of huge, hairy hands pressed against the windscreen. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen with fear." She sat frozen in her seat, watching the hairy hands crawling across the windscreen inches from her face. Then suddenly, as if breaking from her trance, she cried out in fear and the hands mysteriously vanished. She drove on to her destination in Torbay, where she was staying with friends, and she told them about the encounter, thinking that they wouldn't believe her. However, her friends were more familiar with the local legends, and they informed Florence that she'd just had an encounter with the hairy hands of Dartmoor. Another interesting encounter occurred in 1991. A doctor from Somerset was driving along the B3212 when his car crashed and flipped over on that very same stretch of road. The doctor later reported that just before the accident, he felt a deathly cold fill his car. He says, "It was as if something evil was actually inside the car with me. The steering wheel went wild and it was wrenched out of my hands." The most recent case I found is from 2008. A man named Michael Anthony had been visiting Postbridge for business reasons. At about 11 PM he headed home towards Bristol, driving along the dreaded B3212. A short while into his journey, he began to feel unusually cold and his hands started to go numb. Then, all of a sudden, what he described as two giant hairy paws appeared before him and grabbed hold of his own hands before trying to steer the car into the side of the road. Somehow Michael managed to resist these paws, keeping the car on the road without stopping. The paws remained clamped over his own hands, and twice more they attempted to run his vehicle off the road. After the third failed attempt, the paws vanished in a bright flash of light. As they vanished, a strong smell of sulphur filled the car. Note how on these last three reports, despite being decades apart, they all reported the same cold, numbing sensation just before the hands appeared. The smell of sulphur in that last report is also interesting. A sulphuric odour is thought to indicate a demonic entity. It could also perhaps be the smell of gunpowder. About halfway along that cursed stretch of road between Postbridge and Two Bridges, there's a sign for the Powder Mills Pottery Studio. This pottery, according to their website, is housed in granite buildings that were once part of a 19th century gunpowder factory. When it was a working powder factory, they mixed sulphur, saltpeter and charcoal to make explosives for the local quarries. Some locals believe that the hairy hands belong to an ex-worker of the gunpowder factory. As the story goes, there was a blacksmith that worked at the factory repairing machinery. He was well known for having big, strong, hairy hands. Now, due to all the explosive dust in the air, workers at the powder mill had to wear shoes with rope-lined soles to avoid making sparks when they walked about the place. One day, though, the blacksmith had had too many drinks at the local tavern and he walked into the mill wearing his steel-studded boots. As you can probably guess, a spark from his boots caused a massive explosion and he was blown to smithereens. The only parts of his body that were recovered were two hairy hands. and now those same hands roam endlessly up and down that stretch of road, desperately searching for the rest of his body. How much of this story is true is hard to say. There were a number of fires and explosions at the powder mill in the 1850s. An article on the legendary Dartmoor website tells of a fire in 1851 that killed a man, and an explosion in 1857 that killed 2 men named Dodd and Hamlin. I'm not sure if any of these men were blacksmiths with big hairy hands, but I suppose the legend had to start somewhere. And there is another hairy hand story associated with the old powder mill, and I've saved this one for last because I think it's probably the creepiest one. I mentioned earlier the folklorist Theo Brown. She's written extensively about the folklore of Devon over the years, and a lot of the hairy hands reports come from her own books. Well, in 1924, when she was 10 years old, she and her adoptive parents lived for a while in a caravan in Dartmoor. One of the places where they parked their caravan was on the ruins of the old gunpowder factory. On one of the nights that they were parked there, Theo's mother woke up to a frightening sight at the caravan window. The tale was related in the book Devon Ghosts. It says, "I knew there was some power very seriously menacing us near, and I must act very swiftly. As I looked up to the little window at the end of the caravan, I saw something moving, and as I stared, I saw it was the fingers and palm of a very large hand with many hairs on the joints and back of it. It was clawing up and up to the top of the window, which was a little open. I knew it wished to do harm to my husband sleeping below. I knew that the owner of the hand hated us and wished us harm, and I knew it was no ordinary hand, and that no blow or shot could have any power over it. Almost unconsciously, I made the sign of the cross, and I prayed very much that we might be kept safe. At once the hands slowly sank down out of sight, and I knew that the danger was gone. I did say a thankful prayer, and I fell at once into a peaceful sleep. We stayed in that spot for several weeks, but I never felt the evil influence again near the caravan. But I did not feel happy in some places not far off, and I would not for anything have walked alone on the moor at night, or on the tor above our caravan." And so that's the hairy hands. They could belong to a 19th century blacksmith, or to a demonic entity, or something else entirely. Some even think that it could be the work of a mischievous piskie, a mythological elf-like creature that's said to haunt Devon and Cornwall. The naysayers believe that these crashes are simply the result of drivers unfamiliar with the area driving too quickly on the narrow and winding road. Well, whatever the cause, if you're ever driving on the B3212 and you feel a deathly cold or an eerie, malevolent presence, then you might want to drive a little bit more slowly, just in case. So thanks for watching the video. I really like this story and I've been wanting to cover it for a while. I think it's the name that gets me. Hairy Hands. It's so creepy and kind of silly at the same time. I did notice as I was working on this that my friend over at the Pitch Black channel has already covered this legend, so I don't think he'll mind me making a video on the same subject as him, but I think this is a good opportunity to shout out his channel. If you like these sort of stories, I'll put a link to the Pitch Black channel. He covers all sorts of weird stuff like this, so you'll probably enjoy his channel as well. And thanks to all the patrons who are helping to keep the channel running. I am horribly inept at expressing gratitude, but it really does mean a lot that people enjoy my stuff enough to pitch in a couple of quid each month to keep it going, so thanks to all these people. If you like this video, I've got some more creepy folklore stories for you to check out. There should be a link to a playlist on the screen now, and you've got 10 seconds to click it or else hairy hands will come and get you or something, I don't know. Alright, until next time, goodbye.